You're listening to episode 66 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Author and educator Sikivu Hutchinson speaks with us about her book, Moral Combat: Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Value Wars. We struggle with the word atheism in our culture. It's an emotionally charged concept for many, conflicting with dearly held beliefs about the nature of existence, morality, and the divine. For others, it's just an accurate description for our outlook on religion. We are simply atheist, without any belief in deities. Something that's been noticed in our atheist and skeptical communities lately, and this has been questioned more and more, is that the diversity of our overall society is not represented in our atheist and skeptical groups. The conferences we have show a noticeable lack of representation by people of color, and usually the flagship speakers are white, middle-ish aged, and male. That's starting to change as more attention is brought to bear, and that, as critical thinkers, we know there are segments of our culture that are not here with us. We've had wonderful talks with Spring Wisham and Faith Adiela about this on the podcast from a more Buddhist perspective, but we've yet to address it specifically from the non-religious side. So it was my great joy to discover the book Moral Combat, which examines not only the issues of ethnic diversity in our non-religious communities, but how religious institutions have promoted discriminatory practices in their own communities of color. Sikivu Hutchinson is a writer and intergroup specialist for Los Angeles County Human Relations Commission. She received a PhD in Performance Studies from New York University and has taught women's studies, cultural studies, urban studies, and education at UCLA, the California Institute of the Arts, and Western Washington University. She is the author of Imagining Transit, Race, Gender, and Transportation Politics in Los Angeles, and has published fiction, essays, and critical theory in Social Text, California English, Black Agenda Report, and American Atheist Magazine. She is a senior fellow with the Institute for Humanist Studies. And our guest today is Sikivu Hutchinson. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Ted.
So tell us about your background before we get talking about the book that you've written, Moral Combat: Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Value Wars. Tell us a bit about your background and what led you to atheism.
Well, I'm primarily an educator and a writer. My emphasis is on feminism, social justice, heterosexist critique, and critique of organized religion and secular humanism. So those have been my interest in terms of my writing and engagement with community-based organizing. I also work for the LA County Human Relations Commission. I have developed a young women's leadership program that's emphasizing building bridges between African American and Latina young women. We focus on issues of sexual assault awareness, reproductive justice, college preparation, trying to develop civic engagement and mentoring opportunities for young women of color in South LA. We do a lot around media literacy and the negative / pathological representation of young people of color in mainstream media. So those are my areas of interest. As far as coming to an atheist/secular humanist perspective, I grew up in a secular household. I like to say it was a bit of an oasis in a pretty religious, very devout community.
Yes.
And I had parents that were not explicitly atheists, were not explicitly non-believing in terms of our community context, but within our household, we were not steeped in, when I say we, I'm referring to my brother and myself, we were not steeped in dogma of any kind. There were no Bibles present in the household. There was not the ubiquitous picture of the blue-eyed Jesus, staring ethereally into space. Those were fixtures in a lot of African-American households when I was growing up in the 1970s and 80s. And that didn't exist in our immediate household, but we certainly had relatives, extended family, that were very devout, very church-going, very involved in the African-American religious faith community. So we had that kind of presence, cultural presence, but that was not something that we were indoctrinated into. It was a very literary, intellectual, activist family, and I think that is where my parents got their worldview, that, they were coming from a 60s militant perspective, more, I think, socialist, Marxist, perspective on the world and economic justice and race relations. So that's where their ideology was emanating from.
Did you find that was sometimes challenging in having that family structure, which I think was of great benefit in terms of the intellectual views towards life and how we interact socially with each other? But was that challenging when you work with relatives or other people in the community who were much more faith-based?
Yes, it was. It operated on a number of levels of insidiousness. So I went to a Catholic school in ninth grade, and that was a pretty socially and psychologically and emotionally traumatizing experience because, obviously you're subjected to the socialization and indoctrination of those Catholic hierarchies, on a number of levels, not just in terms of the actual Catholic practices, but, also in terms of the gender roles and, the prohibition on homosexuality. So ninth grade was a bit of a trial by fire in terms of my own understanding of myself as an atheist and a non-believer. And I had run-ins with some of the nuns and, some of the teachers, ironically enough, around writing Beatle lyrics on my paper, because that was perceived to be, the height of blasphemy and Satanism, apparently, in their view.
No God above us, no hell below.
Yeah. So those kinds of encounters, I think, really were revelatory for me, in terms of my own sense of identity. But I was not an out atheist insofar as I wouldn't challenge anyone, if they were to come spouting, hyper-religious nonsense, rhetoric, propaganda. I never got into those kinds of exchanges for the most part. I had one exchange with someone, and I recount this in the book, with a girl in, I think it was sixth grade or something, some girl who was very devout and was very disturbed that I didn't go to church, I didn't talk to God on a regular basis, I didn't have a personal relationship with Jesus. So she made it her mission to try and proselytize and convert me. And, at that tender age, I was susceptible to, that line of propaganda, and I tried to talk to God, and it just struck me as abjectly absurd. And that was the end of that experiment.
Well, it's like I have a personal relationship with Thor, mighty god of thunder.
Right, or with a leprechaun, or with the Easter Bunny. When they do
that, be happy to have a relationship with Jesus. That will be fine.
Yeah. So that was the extent of, any real, frontal encounters with hyper-religiosity. But I think the reason why they didn't occur more frequently is because I was not adopting an out posture. Like I said, I wasn't confronting people, when they descended upon me with that kind of propaganda. We got our share of, religious proselytizing and solicitations at our house. And I never really got into any exchanges, with the scores of Jehovah's Witnesses that, descended upon our house, week in and week out, and, all the other Bible thumpers and end times people. So on those interpersonal levels, there weren't a lot of exchanges. And it wasn't until, very recently that I became, more activist and more frontal with expressing, my atheism and really challenging the hierarchies of the Black church in terms of my articles and public speaking and engagement with the community.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, because your book focuses in part on the church, and I wanted to ask how you see the church's institutional values as being detrimental to the Black community.
Well, that's a multi-pronged response. So in the book, I try to be balanced in terms of looking at the instrumentality of religiosity in the Black church vis-a-vis the trajectory of civil rights movement, activism, not just in terms of the modern civil rights movement, because, of course, everyone knows about, MLK and Rosa Parks, and they have been fetishized as being the be-all and end-all for civil rights movement organizing, but really going back to slave times and the whole imposition of Christianity onto African-American people and African-American cultures, and the degree to which the adoption of Christianity was a means of establishing personhood and establishing a connection to Western paradigms of morality for African-American people. So you have that aspect, the epistemological aspect, in addition to the collective community engagement aspect, whereby, peoples of color who were enslaved, who were considered to be subhuman, considered to be objects, commodities, and, essentially driving Western empire, and American enterprise, vis-a-vis the slaveocracy and the plantation regime, that these were peoples who were trying to find a common bond with each other because they had been radically terrorized and brutally dispossessed of their sense of personhood and culture. So there was really no choice in terms of adopting Christianity. So I go into that in the beginning chapters of the book and look at the degree to which African American women utilized the church and Christian ideology, particularly this notion of redemptive suffering, and the degree to which a sense of redemptive suffering buttressed the outlook on social justice activism within African American communities. That was very critical to Black women's sense of self and subjectivity and connection to family and community. That was important. But if we fast forward into the 21st century, where we see that the social gospel has really been perverted by the prosperity gospel, has been perverted by all of these hierarchies of masculinity and femininity that are absolutely enshrined in the Bible, these hierarchies of sexuality that are enshrined in the Bible, these hierarchies of class that are present in the Bible and reinforced in the rank economic injustice that we see in so-called inner-city African-American and Latino communities. That, in my mind, is corrosive and insidious with regard to the cultural capital of contemporary African-American communities. So I get into that in the book, and I also look at the unholy allegiance, if we want to use that metaphor, unholy allegiance that Black churches have forged with the white Christian conservative fundamentalist religious right, and identify there being this emergent Black religious right. And that has not been really framed as such. But, if we look at things like this new campaign against abortion, that's really taken off over the past couple of years, that's been engineered by the Black religious right in league with white Christian fundamentalist activists. And the degree to which that kind of activism, has really informed all of the pernicious anti-abortion legislation that we've seen cropping up in states and, of course, on the federal level.
Like weeds, yeah.
Yes. So I make these connections in the book and, talk about the humanist possibilities for Black liberation struggle here in the 21st century, and the fact that African Americans are hands down the most religious group in the United States and the most poor and disenfranchised group in the United States. What are the connections between the two? How is the grip that organized religion has on African Americans symptomatic of the institutional economic disenfranchisement that poor blacks and even middle-class blacks, given the fallout from the recession, are suffering?
It is, and that's a good segue into our discussion now on the focus of some of the advantages of non-belief. Tell us about that, because I know you're very passionate about an atheist ideological stance being very advantageous to people. Tell us about that.
Well, I frame it in the book in terms of, again, the kind of backlash against social justice, civil rights, and human rights that we've seen over the past few decades. Being engineered, yes, by the religious right, but also by the secular, libertarian, conservative regime of activism. And for me, it's a question of trying to revision and reshape what morality is. And in the book, because I'm assuming a feminist stance, I place a lot of emphasis on the role of public education in this revisioning of public morality and the degree to which public education has really abdicated the role of, playing having some type of, positive impact upon social justice, upon, trying to make the idea of cultural diversity one that is a moral value. And I don't mean cultural diversity just in terms of racial diversity and people holding hands and singing Kumbaya, but I mean in terms of the full complexity of the human family, vis-a-vis sexuality, vis-a-vis gender, vis-a-vis class, that the hierarchies that we see, within American society, the schisms amongst, class, gender, sexuality, and race, in my mind, really emanate from this Judeo-Christian notion of the civilized self and the other. And we see that being played out in the Bible again and again, in terms of, the cultural or racial other, or the sexual other or the gendered other, and the chosen people, and, the anointed. And in my mind, that's very much at play in a notion of education, that views cultural diversity as being parasitic, as being undermining, to the idea of exceptionalist democracy and everyone being liberated individuals with the same kind of opportunity and not needing to look at the complexity of institutional racism and sexism and classism and heterosexism, how those impact upon opportunities to learn for young people within public education. So I take a strong stance on that, particularly when it comes to, questions of gender justice and the way in which young women and young men, continue to perpetuate, this very hierarchical, very masculinist, very patriarchal notions of what it means to be, male and female. And the idea that, again, these are being framed as like secular models of masculinity and femininity, but they actually flow from, these very rigid religious hierarchies, not just within, Judeo-Christian religion, but also if we look in a broader, more global way, in terms of Islam. And I think that there's a nexus, between religious, paradigms, again, of gender and secular paradigms of gender.
Yeah, it's interesting that I always see it having a secular viewpoint that is just, it's devoid of ritual and religious trappings, this association you're talking about, where we say, oh, this hierarchical structure and the separation of identities is very secular, and well, no, it isn't. The secular people that I know, I agree with you that this is rooted in something else, because a secular view is one that is understanding of the multiplicity of our overall human culture, that we do come in different colors and gender preferences and socioeconomic classes and all of that. That's not something where you would find discrimination except in religious institutions. I agree. That's where that seems to be rooted. And the question is, how do we get that message across within our communities that don't seem to understand that, wait a minute, what we want to have, equality and freedom for all, is not coming from our religious texts.
Right, absolutely. I mean, if we look at the emergence of the religious right, I mean, the religious right has become this force within American public policy over the past few decades in response to the successes of the modern civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay liberation movement. So that's not a coincidence, that these regimes of power and authoritarian control are being imposed upon public policy in this day and age.
You've identified, and you're challenging what many of us have identified as a racial imbalance in our atheist groups. And this is a discussion I've had with Debbie Goddard of the Center for Inquiry, and she has wonderful talks about this. And that if we look at the pictures of who are the main speakers at our atheist conferences, they are predominantly middle-aged white guys. And that's not representative of our American culture overall. So how do we change that? As you said early on, the black segment of our American society is also its most religious. How can we turn that around?
Well, in a number of ways. Debbie has talked a lot about the leadership of these organizations, and absolutely the composition of the leadership needs to be changed. There needs to be greater visibility given to those activists, advocates, writers, and intellectuals who are of color and who are challenging the received wisdom within the atheist, secular, humanist community. And the received wisdom, in my view, is that we need to fixate on evolution and science literacy, our version of science literacy.
Yep, the evidence fact-based one. Yes.
Right. And battles against creationism and intelligent design, all of those are important, but that in my mind is very narrow and reductive. And most of the secular humanist atheist folk that I know of color are focused on a broader range of issues that I just articulated, but again, looking at why there is such a necessity to invest in organized religion in communities of color. What is it within American society in particular and in the West in general that makes organized religion such a compelling force? And if we're not going to unpack, again, these structures of institutional racism, sexism, heterosexism, and classism, then secular humanism and atheism are not going to be appealing to broader numbers of people of color because our realities obviously are deeply impacted by all of these regimes of power in a way that white people's lives are not impacted. White people's lives are obviously informed by the privilege of being able to not be impacted by institutional racism, on a day-to-day basis, in terms of, one's options, choices, and opportunities. But there's an education that's required in terms of, why is it that, for example, more African American women are invested in church going, invested in, being involved in church structures, being involved in assuming a leadership role within their families, to moralize and proselytize and, be engaged in adhering to biblical scripture. Why are those imbalances present? And the reality is that getting back to the earlier part of our discussion, religion has been a moralizing influence. And African American women have been viewed as being lesser than, as being hypersexual, as being not within the realm of proper femininity. You have that ideological construct operating there. In addition to not really having the kind of power and agency, within their communities to operate outside of the context of organized religion. So if you don't have critical consciousness about that, as a white person who perceives him or herself to be a progressive atheist, then there's going to be a problem, relating to why it is we need to, quote unquote, diversify our movement. So there's the issue of leadership. There's the issue of worldview, and educating people, white people, to have a critical consciousness about why these issues are important. And there's also, the question of what can be done to make secular humanism more palatable for people of color, in terms of the social welfare apparatus that organized religion provides for communities of color, providing elder care, providing daycare services, providing a space for people to use a computer, because we have low levels of access in our communities, providing utility assistance. These are all things that local churches do, that we don't have, comparable institutions that are secular humanists in our community doing these kinds of things.
Right.
And because of the depth of economic injustice, because African Americans are disproportionately at the poverty level, are disproportionately homeless, are disproportionately, incarcerated, lacking just basics in terms of the social welfare net, the black church is always going to play a huge role, unless there are other institutions to redress that need.
Right. And as white atheists, of course, we challenge the religion ascendancy part, but as white atheists, we tend not to be as aware, sometimes aware at all, that there's something else to challenge as human beings. And that is that imbalance that isn't just on the church, non-church, faith, non-faith scale, but on the what are our racial or gender preference diversities or other diversities that are not represented in our community. Something I wanted to ask you is maybe one of our last questions is, what do you see as some of the near-term opportunities for atheists of color?
Near term is to become more organized. There are a few small organizations that have emerged, over the past couple of years. African Americans for Humanism is one. Black Atheists of America is another. My small group, Black Skeptics, is another. But things are very disparate at this point. There was an African Americans for Humanism conference last year, and that was the largest gathering of African American non-believers in history. And it was a small gathering, about 50 folks. And, since then, the groups have tried to maintain connection with each other. There's been talk of having a second conference. My group is going to have the first in a series of discussions with the Black faith community. We're going to be having a, quote, interfaith dialogue, if that's not an oxymoron for atheists, but an interfaith dialogue, because that's all the rage now, interfaith. So
yep,
that's how
it was in one 2 weeks ago. Yep.
So we're doing that with a local Baptist church. And I think that's the challenge, is to try and more or less create greater visibility opportunities. Mm-hmm. Because since the book has come out, Moral Combat, Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Values Wars, I've gotten a lot of feedback from Black non-believers and fence-sitters and, people that are questioning and saying that they weren't aware that there was even a community. It's, and it's basically an online community for the most part. But there's sprouts. There's, I think, generative signs that it could actually develop into a real-time community that has a stake in all of these issues that we've been talking about: economic justice, liberation of, women of color, reproductive justice, gay liberation, the whole 9 yards. And that was what really compelled me to speak out forcefully back in 2008 when I saw that all of these black churches were rallying in support of Proposition 8 ad nauseum.
Yeah.
And really,
what was that about?
Yeah, representing themselves as, the undisputed monolithic voice of the black community. And so I was deeply enraged by that, and that really compelled me to put it out on Front Street that I'm an atheist. I know that there are other, non-believing African Americans, but people feel marginalized and stigmatized, by the propaganda, the dogma, and the, again, authoritarian regime of religiosity in black communities. So visibility is a really key issue because people feel that they have no place to go in terms of their everyday exchanges. A lot of the folk in the Black Skeptics group are not fully out because they don't feel safe in terms of their work relationships and certainly not their family and community relationships. Mm-hmm. So just having a safe place and being able to see more faces, hear more voices, being able to see that the faith community, or at least the progressive elements of the faith community, are going to be welcoming and interested, in having these kinds of dialogues, is going to be hugely important. In addition to the other things that I identified about connecting with the quote-unquote mainstream atheist community and really making social justice and activism around all of these regimes of power, authority, and control a major emphasis within the so-called mainstream atheist movement.
Now, in the interest of supporting that connectivity, I wanted to mention to people who are listening to the podcast a couple of the web addresses of various places we've been speaking of. blackskeptics.blogspot.com is one, the Black Skeptics organization. Sikivu, you're also editor of blackfemlens.org. Could you tell us just a little bit about that?
Well, that's an online journal of progressive criticism and literature. Anyone is welcome to submit something to that. I've been doing for the past several years, and the focus right now is on the issues that we've been talking about, the intersection between secular humanism, gender justice, and, anti-heterosexist, anti-patriarchal criticism, in addition to contemporary issues of political concern.
So for people who are listening and are interested in checking out that as well, it's blackfemlens.blogspot.com. That's blackfemlens.blogspot.com. We've been speaking with Sikivu Hutchinson. The book is Moral Combat, Black Atheists, Gender Politics, and the Value Wars. Sikivu, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.